Hello and welcome along. So, yes, it's been a while again. So, unfortunately, I've been ill again. I've also had quite a lot going on in personal life and work, and so I have been neglecting the channel somewhat in January. So, apologies for that. Hopefully, this video can make up for it a little bit. Now, what I thought I'd do today with this video is a little bit of more of a casual, off-the-cuff video about the Primarchs, and this is because I'm finally reaching the end of the Horus Heresy. This has been a very long journey, I think, which I started about 15 years ago when I read my first Horus Heresy book. It's probably something like that. Now, over that time, I've stopped and started reread from the beginning again and so on as I've caught up with books that have come out. Or for whatever reason, I've stopped reading them for a time to read something else because it is a huge commitment reading I think it's something 60 plus books. And it stops you reading anything else. So at times I've taken breaks to read other things, other 40k things, and even things outside of 40k, which does exist. But now I'm well into the Siege of Terror, and I think I've got like two, 3 books left. I thought it'd be interesting just to go through the Primarchs and talk about how my views have changed of them due to reading the Heresy, and how they changed throughout reading the Heresy. Probably anyone who hasn't read the Horus Heresy books, or at least looked into the lore that has come up out of those books, out of the writing of those books, won't have a very full picture of those Primarchs, and you'll have kind of a snap judgment of what you think about them based on some sort of surface characteristics, some major events that they were famously involved in and you've heard about, and so you've kind of formed that opinion of them. But when you actually go through all 60 odd books and you read about those famous incidents with the full context of what was going on, and you read about all the not so famous incidents they were involved in, which are perhaps actually even more informative of who they are as characters, you really get a much deeper appreciation for who they are. And that does change what you think about them. Well, it certainly changed what I thought about them anyway. So here we go. This is my thoughts on each Primarch. So let's start with Horus. Well, before I read any of the Horus Heresy books, I obviously had heard about Horus. As the title character of Heresy, is the arch traitor, etc. This very vague idea of Horus as the Emperor's favoured son who turned on the Emperor, and I think I felt like he was essentially the classic villain who was always bad and was always going to be bad, and was somehow put into this position of privilege by the Emperor when he really didn't deserve it, and was waiting for that moment to turn for his own personal reasons, because he just thought he was better than everybody else, but actually he wasn't. That's vaguely how I felt about him, going back that 15 years ago before I started reading the Heresy. And that almost instantly changes as soon as you read the first 2 or 3 books. And it really does a great job of giving you that picture of Horus as actually someone who truly is one of the greatest beings ever to exist, and someone who is actually genuinely good, who has this little flaw in him deep down, but he's not even aware of himself. But he's not an arrogant bully. He's not the comic book villain that's just waiting for his opportunity to turn on the Emperor. If anything, he's one of the more ethical and morally consistent and open-minded, more reasonable Primarchs before he turns. And the way that the authors really build his character up in those first few books, and then as the story goes on in the next few books, is show his path down that route towards becoming the traitor. They do a great job of really selling that journey, and why he ends up like that, and why he becomes the monster he does. So my feelings around Horus really changed in that I thought he was a much more impressive character than I had originally thought, and a much more balanced, well-rounded character than I had appreciated before reading the Heresy. But of course, as the Heresy goes on, he does become this terrible person, and also not just a terrible person, he loses all sense of judgment. He makes all sorts of ridiculous decisions. That is part of his fall. He starts believing in his own myth, if you like. He builds this idea of him being wronged by the Emperor, or he starts to become a much more two-dimensional character as he's corrupted by chaos, and he loses all of those things that made him more impressive in those first few books. But that's fine, because that is part of this story. That's what the corruption does to him. By that time, you lose all admiration for him. But that doesn't change the fact that he was this person before. So that pre-corruption, that pre-heresy Horus is someone you can see as being the Emperor's favoured son and being someone who's incredibly popular and renowned across the Imperium, which I hadn't really appreciated before. Russ. Well, so anyone who's watched my channel before will know that I don't like Russ. And I was trying to think about this, like, when did I first dislike Russ? When did it happen? Was it actually reading the Horus Heresy books that made me feel this way about Russ? And I think they definitely reinforced that feeling. I'm not sure if that started at that point. I think before the books, I had a vague idea of dislike for Russ, simply because of his activities in the burning of Prospero and the lead up to that. I had a rough idea of what went on there, not as full an idea as I got after reading the books. So I already thought he seems like he's a bit of a hypocrite and someone who's made out to be better than he actually is in the sort of general discussion about a 40k lore. And by reading the books, that kind of reinforced that belief and made me really dislike him, because he's just such a hypocrite and he's so easily led into doing bad things by others, and he never really faces up to the mistakes he's made. He always thinks he's better than everyone else, at least most of the time, and he never really learns from his mistakes. He constantly does the same mistakes again. And even on a purely sort of ability level, he doesn't do very well throughout the Heresy. He constantly makes himself out to be practically invincible, but yet constantly gets defeated either in one-on-one fights or in battles, where he proves himself to be an absolutely terrible general on multiple occasions. And yet he has this reputation outside of the books of being some sort of incredible super Primarch who's beyond the others, who is somehow better than them, and when he clearly isn't. That's just part of his personality, that he tries to project this idea of him being better than everyone else. That bravado is, very much part of him fitting into the culture of Fenris, where that's the norm, where you have to project this idea of being the greatest at everything, and you never show any weakness and so on. But the thing is, that doesn't mean that is actually who he is. He's not the greatest at anything, really, and that's what the books really show. They reinforce that sort of inkling I had about him as this hypocrite who isn't really the person he projects himself to be, or the person that people in the general 40k community sort of think about him as this incredible super warrior who never makes any mistakes, who always wins and so on. Well, it's just not true. And if any Primarch's reputation is more damaged than Demon Russ by actually reading the Horus Heresy books, I can't think of one. Really, throughout the books, he just gets worse and worse and is more and more of a difficult character to have any admiration for. It's the only redeeming feature he has amongst the Primarchs is he has this sort of innate deep loyalty to the Emperor. You can never question his loyalty to the Emperor, that's true. But even then, that it kind of actually counts against him, because he can't question the Emperor's loyalty, even when the Emperor is objectively doing ridiculously bad things, either morally bad or just strategically bad. And Russ can't see that at any point. So that almost makes him worse, to be honest. That's my thoughts on Russ. Ferrus Manus. Well, before reading the books, I had very little knowledge of Ferrus Manus, I must say. Like, Ferrus Manus is a character that doesn't really have much background, doesn't really have much talked about him, other than him being killed in the early stages of the Heresy. And I kind of still feel mostly like that, mainly because they don't really do much in those early days of the Heresy to round out his character, give you much more information of what he was like before the Heresy. So I think I'm still left with the general idea of Ferrus as being relatively unimportant and not particularly interesting as far as Primarchs go, not being a particularly pleasant person, someone you probably wouldn't want to spend much time around. Although I do like the way in the books they sort of show the relationship between him and Fulgrim, and they kind of play off of each other. And you can imagine that being quite an interesting duo if they made like a series about the Primarchs. You can imagine them sort of bouncing off of each other. But the thing about that is it kind of really emphasizes that the most interesting thing about Ferrus Manus is his friendship with Fulgrim, rather than anything about himself. So although I do feel like by reading the Horus Heresy books I did build up a greater appreciation for the Iron Hands, I didn't really ever change that view of Ferrus Manus by reading them at all. If anything, it made me increase a negative feeling towards him, or that he's not actually that good. So there you go. That's my off-the-cuff thoughts on the Primarchs, how I felt about them by reading the Horus Heresy books, this epic 60-book-plus series that has taken a huge part of my life, and now I'm giving you the benefit of it. So this has actually taken a lot longer than I thought it was. This video would be, if I put this video out in one go, it's probably going to be like 50 minutes, so I'm not going to do that. So I'll probably have to break it up into 3 parts or something. Let me know in the comments what your thoughts on the Primarchs are, but I'm particularly interested in how they change. So what the ones that you didn't like before reading the books and the ones that you like and then liked afterwards, and vice versa. So try to think about how your ideas changed about Primarchs by reading the books, and that influence that the books have had on you and your thoughts about the Primarchs. Anyway, so I will hopefully see you again relatively soon. Fingers crossed, and thanks for watching. See you next time.